Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Harris, and I am a new tenure track assistant professor in criminology and criminal justice within EPS. So I received my undergraduate degrees in psychology and criminal justice from the University of Arkansas, and my graduate degrees in criminal justice and criminology from Georgia State University. So I've developed an active research agenda that encompasses two main lines of inquiry. So the first is that I have an interest in mental health as it relates to criminological processes. And within this broad area, I'm particularly interested in the experiences of people with mental disorders as they relate to violence and other forms of offending, such as substance abuse and victimization, for example. So as it relates to substance abuse, I've been able to examine how adolescents with depressive symptomatology will sometimes misperceive how normative alcohol usage is amongst their peers, which can indirectly lead to their own misuse of alcohol. I've also studied correlates related to repeat violence amongst people with mental illness, and I've identified several situational, so time variant factors, and dispositional factors, so those are relatively stable, that influence repeat violence for this population. And I finally have assessed other forms of deviance, such as nonviolent offending that people with mental illness engage in. So a common stereotype is that people with mental illness engage in higher rates of violence than the general population. And while this has been discredited in the literature, I actually found that for some forms of nonviolent offending, people with mental illness will actually engage in this form of deviance at a higher rate than violence. The second major interest of mine involves the study of victimization. So within this broad area, I've had the opportunity to explore several topics, including how head injuries, psychopathy, and anomie can impact victimization. And I've also examined perceptions of pro bono work for crime victims among private attorneys in Georgia. And I've recently begun to merge these two streams of interest in mental health and victimization together, which has resulted in a couple projects so far. So for example, in one of these projects, I investigated how perceived stigma may contribute to victimization experiences for people with mental illness. And I've also been focusing on the resiliency process from victimization for people with mental illness. So much of the time in the literature, we focus on identifying risk factors that contribute to victimization for this population. And while this is important, I think it's also equally important to study factors that may protect against these experiences to try and prevent it from occurring in the first place. And some good news for us professors, across analyses, I've been finding that commitment to school has been a major protective factor so far for people with mental illness. So I've recently been thinking about victimization at large-scale events, at least before the pandemic happened, that could lead to collaborations with others at UTD. And so within this line of thinking, I'm currently collecting data with some colleagues back at Georgia State on victimization events at music festivals through telephone interviews. But I think an interesting next step for this that could also require some funding would be to look at bystander intervention at these large-scale events and how this may influence or impact victimization rates. So if there was funding, I think it could be interesting to go to some of these large-scale events after the pandemic and conduct these observations and couple this with interviews of participants at these events. So while I've been focusing on one large-scale event in particular, which is that of music festivals, I think it could be really interesting to see how these victimization patterns and trends may differ at other large-scale events, such as conventions, sporting events, etc. I think another thing that could be really interesting to examine that may also require funding would be to examine if perceptions of risk differ among people with mental illness than their non-disordered counterpart. And I'd of course be open to other ideas, but I think this could be examined through vignettes. So we would present people with mental illness and those without pictures of what criminologists would call a risky situation, and see if and how those perceptions of risk differ across the two. So are people with mental illness able to identify risk? What about their counterparts? Do the two groups differ? And if so, how? I just think this would be a really interesting avenue to pursue that hasn't been looked at yet. So I know that was a very quick synopsis of who I am. So again, my name is Michelle Harris. I'm in the criminology program within EPS. Please feel free to reach out if you are interested in collaborating. Thank you.